So, welcome to Earth.org's EO Talks. Today we have with us Professor Andrew Knoll of Harvard University, who's the author of the book Earth and Life, a 4 Billion Year Conversation. Welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Now, Professor Knoll, you've done something quite extraordinary, which is condensing those 4 billion years into just under 300 pages. But I think this is not your first try. This is not by very much not your first book.
No, I must say that, having spent most of my life writing technical papers for the half dozen people who do the same thing that I do, I've decided in more recent years that maybe I should spend more time trying to help the general public to understand the planet we live on, if for no other reason that will help them to understand 21st century global change. And so I've devoted more time to that. And I must say, I enjoy it. I enjoy writing, and
Mhm.
to the extent that I can help people to understand our planetary home better, I'm happy with that.
And now tell me a little bit about your own background. How did you arrive at this field of study?
Okay, well, it has to be said that when I was 18 and shipping off to university, I hadn't the slightest idea what I wanted to do in life. I was good at math, so I enrolled in an engineering program. But by the end of my first year, it was pretty clear that engineering and I were not destined for a long relationship. At home, it was not popular for me to say I haven't the slightest idea when my dad asked me what I was going to do with life. So when I went back to the university, I just took a whole bunch of math and science courses in hopes that something would rub off. And two things did. First of all, I took a course in geology, and I just loved the idea that you could gain an understanding about our planet by looking at the rocks. And I also loved a course in biology. And again, for many of the same reasons that there are all these clues to evolution on both short and long terms in the biota. And I must admit, I was sitting in my room one night, and it just dawned on me in some nascent way that maybe these two disciplines weren't as different as they seemed to be from the way they were taught. That maybe if I wanted to understand the history of life, I'd be better off if I understood the physical history of the Earth. And equally, if I wanted to understand Earth's physical history, maybe I should understand how biology is contributing to that history. And that was really it. That was sort of my moment to say, now I know what I want to do. And it is pretty much what I've done for the 50 years since.
Now, your field in this book well, the book is about, and your field is geobiology. Can you explain what that is in simple terms?
Sure. Geology, of course, is simply the study of the Earth. And during particularly the 1960s and 70s, two prominent subfields of geology really took off and provided all sorts of new insights into our planet. One, geochemistry, simply uses the principles of chemistry to explore the geologic record. The other, geophysics, does the same thing using principles of physics. So geobiology, in a sense, is using insights from biology and how organisms work to understand uh, the geological record. Or put another way, it's really how Earth and life have interacted to essentially determine the history of our planet and how they continue to do so in the 21st century.
I think this word, a 4 billion year conversation, that is a word that is chosen very carefully. The
Well, it
interaction
is because
between the
I
two.
want people to realize that it what organisms are doing matters to
Hmm.
Earth's environments, and we'll talk about some of the actual examples of that. But for example, we can't understand the history of oxygen in the atmosphere without linking physical and biological processes. Equally, we can't really understand the trajectory of 21st century global change without doing the same thing.
And you mentioned it two times just now. You mentioned geochemistry, and of course, oxygen being the big one. And it was interesting to me to see that the first part of the book is organized around elements. So you start with carbon, and you go talk about, phosphorus, sulfur, and then the story, the very lovely name, the story of O, parts 1 through 3. And I was wondering, why did you decide to use this format?
Well, I think some of the best examples of Earth and life in conversation are really the cycles of the elements that are prominent in biology. So carbon, for example, you're about 40% carbon. And it turns out that, yes, there is a biological carbon cycle that plants and algae take CO2 out of the atmosphere and using energy from sunlight convert that into organic matter. And then organisms from animals to fungi to bacteria eat that carbon. And for the most part, they do it by respiring, what you and I do even as we're talking. They take organic molecules and gain energy from them by reacting them with oxygen. So, in a sense, carbon goes from CO2 to biological carbon back to CO2. There's a short term biological cycle. It interacts with the Earth because about 1% of that carbon that's fixed by photosynthesis won't get re-respired, but will in fact be sedimented in
Hmm.
sediments on the seafloor and lake bottoms and things like this. And now there's a geological component because that material may not be reoxidized to CO2 for millions of years. In fact, some of it will be subducted, a very much geophysical process, and then in the Earth's interior, it will be oxidized to CO2, and that will come out in volcanoes. So to really understand where pretty much every atom in your of carbon is in your that's in your body has been over the last 4 billion years, you have to be able to put together this integrated short and long-term cycling. And the same thing is true for all of the other biologically important elements.
You spend quite a lot of time in the book on the Great Oxygen. So it's the GOE, is it? The Great
That's right,
Oxygen.
yeah.
What is it? Can't remember what the E stands for at the moment. The Great Oxygen Event, was it? Or
Event, yeah.
yeah. And this is, to me, this is the biggest thing on Earth that ever happened that most people have never heard of. And it's fascinating to see what a dramatic transformation that wrought. Just out of curiosity, why do you think most of us haven't ever heard of it? I've certainly never once mentioned in any high school biology class.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure I know the answer, except that, very few high schools in the US or other countries actually teach any substantial geology. So students might learn a lot about bacterial genetics, but nothing about the planet that they're living on. And so I think if we had at least some time to devote to the story of the Earth, again, I think that would be useful because I think every person who is a student now will be confronted with important decisions about the Earth in their lifetime. And so I think we need to know something. And yeah, the story of oxygen is fascinating. I always like to tell students that if you take two sentences, which are both true, first is that life could not have begun on this planet in the presence of substantial amounts of oxygen. And then second, that you and I and most other organisms could not live in the absence of oxygen.
Mhm.
So if both of those things are true, then there had to be a transformation in our planet. And slowly but surely, over the last really 60 years or so, uh, that event, the GOE, between 2.2 and 2.4 billion years ago, has come to light. And again, there are individuals who played a big role in this, but I really want to tip my hat to the thousands of geologists who are out there just mapping and sampling the rocks of our
Mm.
planet and assembling this kind of time record. I mean, they are basically providing the library that we can then consult for understanding our planet's history. So good for them. In terms of uh, the chemistry, again, there's a big geochemical story here. There are some very interesting rocks that are only found, or at least largely found, before 2.4 billion years ago. They're called banded iron formations because they are rich in iron minerals as well as silica. That's the material of chert or if crystallized quartz. And it became apparent to a number of people, not least one of my own mentors, Heinrich Holland, and Dick realized that iron formation couldn't form on a planet like today's, that you had to be able to
Mhm.
move iron freely through the oceans without it ever encountering oxygen, because that would immediately oxidize it to
Which
an
would be
iron oxide
impossible in
rust.
today's ocean.
Yeah, exactly. And so the fact that it was prominent in the geologic record for the first 2 billion years of Earth history, and from practical reasons, it turns out to be that's where most of the iron that is used in industry comes from. It became clear that the Earth was very different. And one by one, a variety of lines of evidence started giving us insight into this transformation. And amazingly, they all pointed to the same time interval. This is 2.2 to 2.4 billion years. And so that, yeah, you're right. That makes a whole new kind of biology possible. It changes the environmental distribution of everything from iron to sulfur to you name it. And the neat thing that has become clearer within my own working lifetime is that when the great oxygenation event was over, there was still only a little bit of oxygen in the atmosphere and surface ocean, and most of the oceans remained oxygen free. It wasn't until much more recently, associated with the age of animals, perhaps not coincidentally, that we
Mhm.
start to see evidence that oxygen was approaching the levels we see today. So it's a long-term story.
Yes, there's a kind of a second blip in one of the charts you show, the big change and then the where I think we get to about 75% of today's levels and then a uh final
Yeah,
the
I think
final
most people would
numbers going
say,
up after that.
yeah, you can get into a bar fight with geochemists about how much oxygen was there, because it turns out that in general,
Hmm.
we're able to identify through geologic proxies when there's no oxygen, a little oxygen, and a lot of oxygen. But if someone tells you they can tell the difference between 5% of present day levels and 10%,
Right.
they're kidding you. So I'd say most people think that there was really only a few percent of
Hmm.
oxygen from about 2.2 billion years ago until very near the beginning of the Cambrian at
Hmm.
540 million years. And we now know, and I'm very happy to say that of the sort of four lines of evidence that document this, three of them came from students in our lab, that it really isn't until about the Devonian period when you start seeing large fish and you start seeing
Hmm.
vertebrates come out onto land that we've approached a world in which most of the oceans are oxygenated. You know,
Hmm.
for 90% of Earth history, the oceans had most of the oceans beneath the surface mix zone simply had no oxygen.
Now, you've talked a little bit about some of these big moments in geobiology, and to a certain extent, your book also traces the history of the field as well as the history of the Earth. And I wondered, could you talk us through a few of those biggest moments where a breakthrough happened that really helped us understand the development of Earth and life?
Yeah, and for most of these, there isn't just one genius who came out of
Mm.
nowhere and solved the problem. But I will say that one of the important people was my own mentor, Elzo Barghorn at Harvard. When Elzo was a young scientist, the oldest fossils that we knew about were things like trilobites from the
Hmm.
beginning of the Cambrian. And Elzo found in some iron formation that was nearly 1.9 billion years old thousands and thousands of microbes preserved
Mm.
in these rocks. And so Elzo did something that no one could ever do again. He quadrupled the known length of the fossil record with one paper. Yeah, that's it. And it was really because of that that the next generation, which includes me, came in and in some detail has tried to build up an understanding of both bacteria and early eukaryotes that eventually gives us the world of our familiarity. So that was important. I think the people who built up the story of oxygen through time, including Dick Holland, was important. And there is one real breakthrough there that's
Hmm.
worth mentioning. Probably about 30 years ago now, in the lab of Mark Tiemens, a very, very good geochemist at University of California at San Diego, there was a very, very good student named James Farquhar. And James was interested in looking at the four um, the four stable isotopes of sulfur.
Hmm.
And that was interesting because people have been looking at sulfur isotopes for a long time because things like bacterial sulfate reduction actually fractionate those isotopes. That is, they actually
Hmm.
take preferentially use the lighter isotope than the heavier one by a known amount. And although there are four stable isotopes of sulfur, usually people only measure two of them because they were much more abundant. It was challenging to measure the other two. And because all the processes that we knew about were sort of mass dependent, which means that the amount of fractionation you see depends on the mass of the isotope. So if you know the fractionation between 34S and 32S, you can calculate 33.
Hmm.
But what happened when James started looking at the four isotopes of sulfur on Mars, that he observed patterns of fractionation that were not mass dependent. Something else was going on, and he and Mark really came to the conclusion that it had to do with photochemical processes in the atmosphere on a planet that had perishingly little oxygen.
Mm.
And then what James did was looked at old rocks on Earth and noticed that they also showed this pattern of mass independent fractionation. And they were actually able to quantify how much oxygen you needed to quench that pattern.
Hmm.
And that in turn said that, before 2.4 billion years ago, on average, Earth's atmosphere had something like 10 to the negative 6
Mm.
atmospheres
About
of
two.
oxygen. So that really it's one of the few really solid quantitative points that confirms that there just was exceedingly little oxygen for the first half of our planet's history.
Mm. Now you've been in the field for a long time and in a certain way helped to create the field or are a creator of the field. And I'd be curious, this was a development probably you just mentioned offering more insight about something that was to a certain extent that I think you knew it was happening, but this is something that was um, a big breakthrough of in how it was the amounts you were talking about. What are
Yeah.
some of the developments where it was surprising to you or even had made you revise your thoughts on what you assumed was settled science? Um, I mean, the,
That's an interesting question, and fortunately, there's so little that has been considered settled about the first 90% of our planet's history that it's not easy to answer. I mean,
other
there
than the
were.
fact that it was created in the year 4004 BC, you know.
Yeah, well, that is again that is a very important development. The discovery of radioactivity was right around the beginning of the 20th century, and within a few years, a really remarkable Irish polymath scientist named John Joly had applied that to Devonian rocks and concluded they were 400 million years old, which is not a
Mm,
bad guess for
mm,
something that early. And on about the same time scale, a Scottish geologist named Arthur Holmes looked at very old rocks, and it became clear that the Earth was not millions of years old. The Earth was billions of years
mm,
old. So the discovery of an application of radioactivity was a game changer, although it must be said that it really wasn't until new generations of instruments and a real effort to map the ancient rocks of the earth during beginning in the 1960s and continuing today that we came to have the kind of quantified
Mm.
geological timescale that you can find on pretty much anywhere on the internet today.
Um, so has there been anything where you said you thought it was this way, and then something new came up, and you said, "Wow, I've really had to change my mind."
Well, I think one of the fields, and I'm more of an observer than a participant in real origin of life studies. But one of the game-changing things was two scientists by the name of Check and Altman discovered that some forms of RNA are not simply the handmaidens to DNA and replication, but in fact can be catalysts like proteins.
Hmm.
And that, in some ways, maybe misleadingly, uh, suggested that there was a solution to this paradox of since you need both nucleic acids and
Hmm.
proteins to make more nucleic acids and
Right.
proteins, how does this all get started? And something called the concept of the RNA world
Hmm.
became important. And that really fostered some wonderful research by people like my friends Jack Szostak and Jerry Joyce, who showed how you could get, very powerful natural selection on
Hmm.
these RNA catalysts called ribozymes. And that was very important. But again, it didn't solve the problem of where the proteins come from in this.
Hmm.
And so there's been, although that I think that stuff was transformative in giving us new experimental avenues in origin of life. Now, not least through the work of a man named John Sutherland at Cambridge University, um, people are going back to the idea that maybe the the prologues to both the nucleic acids and proteins co-evolved on the
Mm.
early Earth, and that maybe there never was a period when there was no interactions
Hmm.
between what we now see as the protein world and the nucleic acid world. And again, I just get very excited by the work of John and some of his colleagues because it's and they're now this can be done in lakes because drying and wetting is
Hmm.
something that helps to make this chemistry go. So I see on the horizon really new insights to the fundamental question of how did life get here? And again, one other thing that's worth mentioning is that we live at a time that is unprecedented in our ability to think about life beyond our planet.
Mm.
I had the great privilege of being on the first science team for a Mars rover, the Mir rovers, some years ago. And, for the first time, we could go to another planet and study its geologic history the same way we do with sedimentary rocks on Earth. And, of course, there's been much more on Mars. There's been, increasingly refined understanding, not so much of outer planets in our solar system, but the moons of those planets, places
Mm.
like Enceladus, which is not a bad candidate if you want to look for life elsewhere in this
I mean,
solar
that's
system.
that's of course the challenge is that Earth doesn't have a control group, nothing to
Well,
compare against.
that's exactly right. I mean, and it's still the case that we only have diagnostic evidence of life at one place in the
Mm.
universe, and that's us. Although most people, interestingly, there was a poll taken of scientists 2 years ago, and something close to 90% of all scientists think that there is life elsewhere in the universe.
Mm.
And the logic of that is very simple, and that is, let's say that only 1 in a million planets or moons
Hmm.
develops life. Now, in a universe that has something like 2 trillion galaxies, and each of them has
Hmm.
100 million stars, that's a
Right.
lot of opportunities for life. The trick is finding evidence of it, and I think I mean, there's some very interesting things that have gone on Mars in the last year or so that's at least are consistent with the idea that life
Mm.
existed in the past. But we're still, I think, a long way away from having any mapped understanding of
Mm.
how life is
I think.
distributed in the universe. And then just to finish off the discussion, one thing that strikes me there's a very famous statement by the Nobel laureate Enrico Fermi when somebody asked him about life in the universe. He just looked at them and he said, "Where is everybody?"
Yeah.
And that's a really good question.
Mm,
And one of the things that occurs to me is that maybe Earth is not unusual in having developed life. Maybe that happens all the time, but it may be unusual in having life that has persisted for 4 billion years, which
mm,
has given us both the time and the environmental history to, evolve things that can actually think about those kind of processes. So there might be all sorts of, 90-day wonders for life all over the universe, but things where life persists long enough to potentially develop the kind of technological uh, civilizations that are
mm.
probably about the only thing we'll ever know about life in the far reaches of the universe. So
I mean, one thing you
just a
point
thought.
out, which is certainly a reason to, I'm not sure if I should say optimism, but a reason to think that there could be life elsewhere, is the fact that life developed comparatively fast after the Earth itself was formed. Um, I mean, I think you said in the book something along the lines of we run out of rocks before we, if we as the farther back we go, we run out of rocks before we run out of evidence of life, something along those lines.
No, that's exactly right.
Mm,
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems of, I mean, the great beauty of our planet is it records its own history in the rock
mm,
record. One of the problems is that Earth is writing that history with one hand and erasing it with the
right.
other. And when you get back to very early times in Earth history, most of the record is erased. So you're
Hmm.
absolutely right that we sort of run out of easily interpretable sedimentary rocks by about 3.8 billion years ago. And there's already evidence for a biological carbon cycle in,
Right.
in those rocks. I do remember, I was actually at this meeting years ago. Uh, the great origin of life pioneer Stanley Miller was giving a talk,
Hmm.
and somebody asked him, they said, "Stanley, how long would it take for life to begin?" And, Stanley thinks for a moment and he says, "Well, he says, I think a decade is probably too short." And he
Mm,
says, maybe a century is too short, but if you can't do it in a million years, you can't do it. And that reflects
mm,
his conviction that life isn't something that springs from inherently unlikely processes and may or may not happen. In Stanley's mind and in the minds of many other people, it's a sort of determinative chemistry that if the
mm,
planet has the right conditions, life can originate fairly rapidly.
right.
So now, having said all of that, I think most people are convinced that life was probably around by 4 billion years ago, which still gives you close to 600 million years to
Mm,
have the Earth become habitable in that. But at least it's pretty clear that Earth has been an inhabited planet for most of its history.
mm. Now we've talked about this big, this big question, what the origin of life on Earth, the origins of or the existence of life elsewhere. What are some of the big unknowns in the field, the unanswered questions, and maybe some narrower ones, the ones that you might hope that like, hey, this is the thing that I hope my team will discover, or maybe the next generation will discover or figure
Yeah,
out.
I think one of the things, and we're going to go back to the oxygen cycle here, that, we've already talked about the GOE. What we didn't talk
Mm,
about is why did that happen and why did it happen when it did? Um,
mm,
and I think most people would agree that you need life because the only real source of oxygen that could transform our planet is photosynthesis by, or photosynthetic bacteria like
mhm,
cyanobacteria. And but there's now increasing evidence that organisms that produced and used oxygen were present hundreds of millions of years before the GOE. So that makes it a different question. That now people are starting to ask, if cyanobacteria existed, what kept their primary production low enough
mm,
that they couldn't oxygenate the planet? And a lot of us, and I've been involved with a really good Chinese colleague in some of this work, look at phosphorus because it turns out if there's no oxygen, there are things other than water that photosynthetic bacteria can use as the source of the electrons they need to make organic matter. Um, and so we still see those organisms. You know, if you have uh, water that's in the photic zone but does not have oxygen in it, it will have things like sulfide, ferrous
Mm,
iron, things like this. And not only are those sources of electrons, but it's a whole lot cheaper to use them than it is water. Well, it's pretty expensive
mm,
to break down water and grab its electrons. So in a world that probably had these alternative electron donors in the sunlit oceans, if there was not enough phosphorus to basically use all that up, then oxygen producing cyanobacteria won't become globally important. And so the question is, what could keep phosphorus down? And there's all sorts of answers to that. It can react with iron in solution and make iron phosphate minerals that pull it out
mhm,
of the water column. It's also the case that for much of the so-called Archean, that is the time before 2.5 billion years ago, that for much of that, Earth seems to have been largely a water world. That, yeah, there were volcanoes here and there and maybe some
mm,
microcontinents, but largely, if you had had a satellite view of the Earth, 2.8 billion years ago, you would have seen mostly water. And under those conditions, just the weathering fluxes of phosphorus from the weathering of volcanoes and continental rocks would have been low. So again, there's a lot of arguments about exactly what happened and what the relationships are. But I think just within the past few years, the whole way we're approaching that problem has changed, and in a way that I think I will still be alive when there's consensus on this issue.
I'm looking forward to that part. Now, one other thing I'd like to ask you about, you do get to the modern changes later, but you have a chapter about climate change. And it's not climate change in the way we're thinking about anthropogenic climate change today. It's about the massive changes that the Earth's climate has experienced over hundreds of millions of years.
Yeah.
And of course, there's climate deniers who say, "Oh, the climate is always changing, and this one is no different." So I'd like to ask you, how does the current anthropogenic climate change situation stack up against these enormous historic changes? So talk
Yeah.
us through a little bit what was happening over these hundreds of millions of years.
Yeah, I mean that's a good question, and I think it is important to use the past as a distant mirror on the 21st century so we can understand what is similar to the past, what is different from the past. Um, it is the case that Earth has had episodic ice ages throughout its history, going back
Hmm.
really to the Archean and including both around 2.1 billion year or 2.4 billion years ago, and again between 7 and 600 million years ago. There were ice ages that had glacial ice at sea level at the equator, the so-called snowball Earth events. So there have been glaciations that are far more severe than anything that we have uh, seen in the time of not only humans but our closest relatives. It's also been much warmer than
Hmm.
anything anticipated for the end of the 21st century, and organisms did just fine. Now, that said, there have been at least 5 times in the age of animals when a high proportion of all the recorded species went extinct on a short time scale. And that, when you say, well, what drove that? There's no one cause, but they all have one thing in common, and that is that the climate change was rapid.
Hmm.
Now, that brings us to the 21st century, where a lot of people think this is some of the fastest climate change that we
Hmm.
know of in Earth history. The fact that the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere has increased by more than a third in my lifetime, the idea that, globally the planet has warmed by a degree and a half Celsius
Hmm.
in my lifetime, you know, you extrapolate that to millions of years, and those are hugely,
Mm,
important changes. So I think one of the things that we have to bear in mind is that while there have been things like massive volcanism, like the impact of a meteorite that are really not on in the cards for the next century, it's really the rapidity of these. And then
mm,
added to that, there's another thing that I think sometimes the climate skeptics fail to think about. I was taken about a year ago. I was reading, and I do read climate skeptics. Sometimes they have some interesting ideas. And this person pointed out correctly that, during the Miocene epoch, 10 million years ago, sea level went up and down and nobody noticed. Nobody went extinct. And, that's true. But now let's put Miami or Venice or Bangkok in there, and it's suddenly a very different picture.
mm,
And I think that's the other thing we have to keep in mind, that because of human activities, whether it has been, you know, changing the face of the land surface in favor of agriculture, whether it is building roads and buildings and building
hmm
right to the edge of sea level, uh, because of our own activities, we are probably more vulnerable to
mm,
rapid climate change than was true of climate change in the past.
mm. So you think the big five catastrophic events may be, from our point of view, a big six, but maybe not from the rest of the animals on the planet?
Well, yeah, we don't. I'm not sure I'd be either willing or able to predict what the loss of biological diversity over the next 50 years will be, and in part it depends on
The-
decisions we
Right.
we make. Um, I'm not convinced that by the end of the century we will have seen losses comparable to what happened, let's say, at the end of the Permian when 90% or so
Right.
of the marine animals disappeared. On the other hand, we could easily lose 25 or 30%. And I think that would be a tragedy. I think it would be a failure of human stewardship of the planet. And, it is still the case that that doesn't need to happen. But there has to be a public will for it to happen. Um, and we'll see what coming decades show.
You said you didn't want to end this book on a sad note, as you had maybe had some previous books, and you spend the last part of the book talking about the worlds beyond Earth. And it made me wonder if, since you've spent your life in the field of geobiology, if you had a second lifetime, what would you study? Would you become an areologist, or would you what would you be, trying to wait for the ships to take us to Titan and have a look there?
Um, I'm actually interested in astrobiology, which I see mostly as a exploration.
Or
You can
you'd
do
say,
all
no,
sorts of,
I'd be a lumberjack next round.
well, who knows? If I were 10 inches taller and talented, I'd play basketball probably. No, I will say that long before I ever wanted to be a scientist, I thought I might be a writer.
Hmm.
And so I'm actually very pleased that writing has become an important part of my scientific work. And so I think if I had it to do over again, and fortunately I don't, um, I think it would be something that involved writing.
Well, that brings us back to the book. And so thank you very much for talking to us today. We've been talking to Professor Andrew Knoll, and his book is Earth and Life, a 4 billion year conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.